All right, everybody, we will get started now. Good evening, everyone. My name is Shruti Bhatnagar, and I am the chair of the Sierra Club Montgomery County group. Thank you all for joining today's session and conversation on facts and future of forest conservation in Maryland. Sierra Club has a long history of working to protect forest and natural places, going back to the formation of the organization in 1892 by John Muir and early advocacy to defend Yosemite. In Maryland, we've been a long-time partner of state efforts, provided tools to local advocates across the state, leading to significant local protection, including preservation of Mattoon Creek and Chapman Forest in southern Maryland, support for the protection of 10 Mile Creek in Montgomery County, and many more. Founding partner in the Smarter Growth Alliance of Charles County, the Smarter Growth Alliance of Frederick County, and many local coalitions. Sierra Club has been monitoring and support of the states. At the level, we've played a major role in the creation of Maryland's Wildland Program and expansion in 2014, supporting recent efforts to strengthen the Forest Conservation Act and supporting ensure that forest mitigation banking. So with that, we have a wonderful panel today, and if you can all keep yourself on mute during the presentations, we will have a conversation with our panelists who have some presentations and information to share with you today. And after that, we will open it up for Q&As. So hold off on putting your questions in the chat until after the presentations, just because we want to make sure we don't lose track. We are monitoring the chat. We did get some questions in advance, and we will try our best to cover all of them. But at the end of the presentation, we will also share the contact information of all the panelists with you, so that you can email them directly if you would like to follow up on anything. So with that, I would like to introduce the panelists for today. We have Sarah Anderson, who is the Director of Career Pathways, American Forests, which is an organization that advocates for healthy forests as a pathway to slow climate change and promote social equity. Ms. Anderson focuses on improving equitable access to quality urban tree canopy, as well as access to careers, growing, maintaining, and reusing that canopy. Ben Alexandro is the Water Program Director for Maryland League of Conservation Voters, which is a statewide nonpartisan organization that uses political action and education to protect our air, land, water, and communities. Mr. Alexandro is the Maryland lead for Choose Clean Water Coalition and is focused on water and land conservation, science, and policy issues. Kristin Taddei is the Forest Conservation Planner and Coordinator for Montgomery County Planning Department that implements and enforces the county's forest conservation law and its associated tree planting and forest conservation programs. Ms. Taddei is responsible for overseeing Montgomery County's forest conservation program, including forest mitigation banking, reforestation, and tree planting, as well as providing information and resources for county agencies and residents. Denisse Guitarra is Maryland Conservation Advocate for Audobon Naturalist Society, which is the oldest independent environmental organization in the Washington, D.C. region and a pioneer in linking conservation activities with environmental education. Ms. Guitarra advocates and educates for a number of local environmental issues related to forest conservation, water protection, impacts of transportation projects, and legislative priorities. So thanks to all of our panelists for joining us today. I also want to give a shout out to Gary from Sierra Club Maryland, who is offering tech support and helping us, and Amanda Farber, who is moderating with me to track Q&As in the chat and with this forum today. So thank you all. And with that, I would like to give it to Kristin, who's going to start off today's presentation.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here so I can get my presentation up. Let's just get that started first. Give me just a moment here. Right. Shruti, can you confirm that you can all see my screen okay? Or anybody?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So good evening, everyone. I'm Kristin Taddei, and I'm the Forest Conservation Programs Manager for Montgomery Planning, which is part of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. and I'm one of the environmental staff within the planning department implementing the forest conservation law. So I'm really excited to be with you tonight to discuss the Montgomery County Forest Conservation Law and its related programs specific to Montgomery County. So during tonight's presentation, I'm going to go over the background on the forest conservation law, how it came about, which projects are subject to it, how the planning department's environmental staff determine requirements for each project, how those projects comply with the forest conservation law, and finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the Forest Mitigation Bank and Reforest Montgomery programs that come about because of the forest conservation law. So I'm going to cover the forest conservation law in Montgomery County tonight, but it's important to note that this is not the only relevant law in this space. There are other laws like the county's tree canopy law and the roadside trees protection law, which are implemented by the county government, not the commission. So those are important to know about as well. Also, the forest conservation law does not, for the most part, regulate individual trees. It focuses mainly on regulating forests. And so even then, the law does not regulate all forest in the county. So some local municipalities follow the state's law or they have their own, and not all projects in the county that remove forests are subject to the county law. So for example, a state-led project in Montgomery County would not be subject to the county's forest conservation law. And just by way of background, there is a lot of great data on regulated forests in the county available through our website, montgomeryplanning.org, which includes this Q&A section on our forest conservation law page and our latest annual report. So I do have a slide at the end of the presentation, which we can share with all of the resources that I mentioned tonight. And I think Shruti may send some links around as I'm speaking as well. But just to mention, this data only includes that regulated forest through the county's forest conservation law. And again, that's not all the forests in the county. So all jurisdictions in Maryland are required to comply with the state's forest conservation law, which we typically refer to as the Maryland Forest Conservation Act of 1991. Many counties, including Montgomery County, have opted to create their own forest conservation law, which must follow the state's enabling law, but can be stronger. So this has resulted in Montgomery County's Forest Conservation Law, or Chapter 22A of the Montgomery County Code, which was established in 1992 and is more strict than the state law. And any proposed change to our county law must be approved by the state. So the first question is, what types of projects are subject to the forest conservation law? And generally, projects on tracts of land greater than 40,000 square feet that are required to submit a development application or obtain a sediment control permit must comply with the forest conservation law. If a project is subject to the law, then there are two routes an applicant can take to comply with it. They can either submit an application for an exemption from submitting a forest conservation plan, or they can submit a forest conservation plan. So the term exemption can be a little confusing here. We're not talking about an exemption from the law, but an exemption from the forest conservation plan requirement of the law. So these might be smaller projects, for example, with little to no impact on forests, but they're still subject to the law and they're still required to submit an application to the planning department for review. And they may come out of that application process with planting requirements. If the project does not qualify for an exemption, then the applicant must submit a forest conservation plan to the planning department for review. During the review, the environmental reviewer works very closely with the applicant to request changes to the plan that will result in the least impact to existing forests and the largest planting requirement possible. So the reviewer also determines what the forest mitigation requirement will be. And every project has a different forest mitigation requirement depending on the total tract area, the area of the existing cover, area of forest to be cleared, if any, and the land use category. So all of those criteria are plugged into this worksheet, which is available on our website. And this is how the forest mitigation requirement that the applicant will be required to meet is determined. So then both the requirement, which is set as a number of acres to be reforested or afforested, and the method that the applicant must use to meet that requirement are recorded in the approved forest conservation plan. So when determining what options an applicant has to meet their forest conservation requirements, the environmental reviewers go through what we call the preferred sequence. So the first preference is for the applicant to protect and plant forest on the development site or offsite in the same watershed. If that's not possible, the second preference is for the applicant to purchase credits from a forest mitigation bank. And the third preference is for the applicant to make a fee in lieu payment. So if we had more time, I'd go over several example forest conservation plans to show how requirements vary depending on the unique conditions of each project. But we can talk more about that during the Q&A. For now, I'll just share one example of a recently approved forest conservation plan for a solar project called Fieldcrest Community Solar. And this has not been built yet, but its FCP was recently approved. So this is a 20-acre site with no existing forest at the intersection of Fieldcrest Road and Olney-Laytonsville Road in Montgomery County. And it's subject to the forest conservation law because it's on a tract of land greater than 40,000 square feet, and it requires a site plan to be submitted to the planning department. So here's the forest conservation worksheet directly from the forest conservation plan for this project. So as you can see, there's no forest on the property, but the size of the project and the zone results in a 4-acre afforestation requirement, which will be met through on-site planting. In fact, this applicant decided to go above and beyond by planting over 6 acres, and 8 acres of the property will be conveyed to the Parks Department. Also, to achieve this project, the applicant proposed a small encroachment into the environmental buffer near the stream that runs through the property. So since the impact of solar panels on the edge of that buffer was minimal, staff allowed this encroachment in exchange for 3-to-1 mitigation, which will be met by purchasing 5.28 acres of credit from a forest mitigation bank. So speaking of the Forest Mitigation Bank program, there are 2 sides to this program. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about how forest banks are established, and then we'll discuss how applicants purchase credits from those banks to meet requirements. So to establish a bank, property owners submit an application to the planning department to either protect existing forest or plant new forest. So this creates the incentive for property owners that own large swaths of the county's mature forest to earn income by protecting that mature forest and selling credits, instead of alternatives for earning income off their land like timber harvesting or selling to a developer. If a property owner has a lot of unforested property, they can plant forest to eventually sell credits in a bank. So this option takes a significant amount of upfront investment to plant the trees, and the property owner must then wait to sell credits until the new forest has met survivability requirements. So that takes at least 2 years, but often longer, perhaps on average about 5 years until credits can be sold. So once a bank is approved to sell credits, I'm getting some feedback. I wonder if you're not on mute. So once a bank is approved to sell credits, it becomes listed on our website, and applicants can purchase credits to meet their forest mitigation requirements. So let's say an applicant's forest mitigation requirement is 1 acre. If they're purchasing credits from a forest mitigation bank that protects existing forests, they must purchase 2 acres. If they're purchasing credits from a forest mitigation bank that planted new forests, they must purchase 1 acre. So by making credits more expensive for existing forest banks, it creates incentives to purchase from planted forest banks. But unfortunately, those barriers to establishing those planted forest banks are still there. So 8 months ago, the Maryland Attorney General published an opinion that challenged whether forest mitigation banks should continue to be used the way they were being used in Maryland. So we at the Commission knew the immense value that the Forest Mitigation Bank program has, particularly as an effective tool for protecting our mature forests in Montgomery County. So the Commission advocated for a state amendment to be introduced that would allow forest banking to continue as it had been for over 25 years. So this state amendment was introduced as House Bill 991. However, changes were made to the bill through the legislative process that now have the opposite effect on the Forest Mitigation Bank program as what was originally intended. And I'm going to explain how we at the Planning Department are now seeing this play out. So this recent state amendment no longer allows property owners with existing mature forests to apply to preserve that forest in a forest mitigation bank and earn income while doing so. So we are rapidly in Montgomery County running out of forest mitigation bank credits. And because of the amendment, we're not able to accept new applications for existing forest banks in order to replace those credits. And perhaps the biggest problem to come out of the amendment is this. Because the incentive to earn income by protecting existing forest is gone, I have received numerous calls and emails from property owners that were interested in preserving their forests, and now they're turning to alternatives. So for example, one property owner had an application to protect over 100 acres of mature forest in process when the opinion was published. So now that we had to turn that application away, this property owner is considering timber harvesting and then replanting a forest bank in its place. We also have been working with another property owner who was working on his estate planning and wanted to make sure his 80-acre forest would be protected for future generations of his family. And he wanted to do that through protecting that forest in a forest mitigation bank. And now, unfortunately, at least currently, there's no way for that to happen. So as you can imagine, that's pretty gut-wrenching. And my hope is that another amendment will be introduced at the state that would reestablish these incentives to protect forests so that we can ensure no net loss of forest in Montgomery County. So now back to that third option in the preferred sequence, which is paying a fee in lieu. So if the forest mitigation requirement is less than half an acre, the environmental reviewer may determine that the applicant can make a fee in lieu payment instead of purchasing from a forest mitigation bank. So the Forest Mitigation Fund is mainly made up of infrequent, small contributions, and it's essentially a way for the applicant to transfer their requirement to the Planning Department. So if an applicant's requirement is paying a fee in lieu to meet a requirement of 1 acre, the Planning Department assumes that requirement. But through partnerships and creativity, we're able to stretch fee in lieu. So we take that funding and reforest about 1.5 acres. And then there's still a little left over for tree planting and discount programs. We also have a great webpage on the Forest Conservation Fund, which we will send the link to. This keeps track of our spending and shows the requirements we've assumed versus how many acres we've planted. And it's this fund that finances the 5 programs of Reforest Montgomery. So within the Reforest Montgomery program, we partner with the Parks Department to reforest parkland. And one way that we're able to do this efficiently is by purchasing trees from the Parks Department's coat farm for significantly less than they would be through a nursery or contractor. We also partner with Montgomery Countryside Alliance to reforest select properties in the agricultural reserve. So MCA is a nonprofit, and they use some awesome volunteer groups to maintain the young forest, so we save some funding there. We're also beginning to work directly with private property owners to reforest areas of old forest conservation easements that are partially unforested. The Reforest Montgomery program also funds the Reforest Montgomery free shade tree and native tree discount programs, which offer some trees to eligible residents in Montgomery County for free or at a discount. So I'm going to leave it there, even though I could certainly talk all night about these topics. And I'm going to turn it over to Ben for the next presentation. So I'll stop sharing here.
Great, thank you. Should I just take it away?
We are just doing a poll right now before we get started with Ben's presentation. It's on your screens. How much do you know about forest conservation? And I see a lot of people responding already, so thank you. Please continue to put your responses in. So far, we have 34% people saying I'm new to the topic, 47% people saying I'm familiar with the topic but want to learn more, and 18% people saying, I live and breathe this topic. So thank you so much for another 45 seconds for the poll, a minute. All right, we will end the polling and share the results with everyone. 32% I'm new to the topic, 50% I'm familiar with the topic and want to learn more, 18% I live and breathe this topic. Well, thank you so much for sharing the response to the poll. And with that, I will hand it over to Ben.
All right, great. Let's make sure I can do this, and hopefully this will work just fine. Can everyone see this all right?
We can see it.
Excellent. So I want to talk a little bit about the state minimum law and a little bit about what has been done elsewhere to improve it. You know, as you can see, there's quite a lot that's in the Forest Conservation Act locally and statewide that is really laudable. Quite a lot of good work that's happening on the ground. However, we've also seen some ways that it can really be improved in a lot of different cases, especially when we're looking at what the state minimum is. And so I'm going to be talking about a little tiny bit about what some of the issues are with that state minimum law, and then what some of the upgrades that a number of different counties have been able to do. And then I'm going to be talking very slightly touching on some of the changes that Montgomery County's made, but I think mostly other folks have covered that or will be covering that during this presentation, and getting us to just start thinking about later in the presentation when we'll be thinking about you know, what could potentially be done on the state level, local level, etc. So let's jump into that. And despite having, in a lot of ways, a really, really ambitious, at the time, Forest Conservation Act statewide, data is looking like Maryland's losing on average, now this is statewide, not just the county, right? But statewide, losing on average about a dozen acres of forests per day. So that's, you know, adding up to thousands of acres per year. And it comes down to having some significant loopholes. And I want to make something clear that the state minimum Forest Conservation Act does not reach no net loss, right? And Montgomery County also does not have no net loss of forests. The state law, and this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but it's about 1 acre of forest is replanted for every 4 acres taken, is that ratio, right? So now that depends on how much you retain on site, right? That depends on, at a certain point after you take so much, then you may have to replant some. That also doesn't take into account the fact that there's afforestation ratios, which is great, that you look at if you go to a completely empty field, like what Kristin was showing, and you are going there, you have to also replant some, which is great because, you know, when we have a development, we don't want people living in a concrete jungle that don't have any of the great benefits that forests provide for air quality, for water quality, for you know, reduction in asthma, reducing stress, etc. But, you know, it in some ways could even create some incentives where the developers will have to do some less by retaining rather than having to replant. So really showed on the state level why we needed to have some really big upgrades. And that's something that I've been working on for a number of years, trying to look at a number of state solutions that we tried to get past, right? So for numbers of years, we've been doing and trying to do some bigger comprehensive fixes on the Forest Conservation Act that were not successful, though we did have 2 minor victories in 2019. One was on one that upgraded the fee in lieu, like the fee you have to pay, and making sure counties are more transparent on how they're using it, and making sure that the money and the funding is going to the right places, because there were some issues, not in Montgomery, but in a number of counties, that on transparency wide. Another one was on looking at study to see what's really causing the most loss in which area, caused by what things, etc. I'm sorry, I think I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Hopefully you can all still hear me. But the lack of a strong state policy has prompted that a number of counties to adopt more stringent laws and ordinances, and Montgomery County is one of those. So on the county level, I'm going to be really focusing on these 4 that we passed since 2019 that really did prioritize contiguous forest protection, increasing the replanting requirements, raising the fee amount for developers who do not replant, and increasing the thresholds, basically looking at whether or not you have to replant the 4-to-1, or at a certain point it actually switches around to you have to start replanting twice as much as what you take down after a certain level. So I'm going to go through some of these just to give some ideas of what other approaches were looked at, were thought about. This is actually an interesting approach at Anne Arundel County where the county executive and the county's administration kind of started, and we're looking at different areas of thinking. Not all forests are created equal, and maybe we should try to protect ones that are really in these greenways and green infrastructure more, and but then have less stringent protection areas in like inside targeted growth areas, so that we can really focus on growing and having smarter growth in those areas, and focus on avoiding growing in some other areas. Unfortunately, there's a lot of compromises, et cetera, that needed to happen in Anne Arundel County Council, and it's a very purple county to make a lot of these things happen. Though you'll see that just because it's a purple county doesn't mean that you can't go stronger than this, as I'll show you in just a bit. But what ended up happening is they did slightly improve this kind of conservation threshold. They ended up doubling replanting ratio. So for every 1 acre you take down, you replant 2 acres. Really did a lot to protect forested streams and big forested areas. They increased the violations for those that are like willfully know what they're supposed to be doing, and willfully, like big developers that are willfully doing the wrong thing. But it did have a bad grandfathering clause in there that they're really regretting now, because basically anybody that submitted any sort of application, even though if the application was basically like a cocktail napkin and would never be accepted, was allowed in under these old laws, which was frustrating. Howard County had a little bit of a different approach, because it was a little bit of a different issue. Anne Arundel County was, when I was talking about those dozen acres of trees a day, a lot of those were in Anne Arundel County, though they were losing forests hand over fist, right? And it was their biggest areas of contiguous forest that was least protected in the county because of some of the loopholes on that state minimum, right? Howard County had a different issue where like they already lost a lot of their big forests like 20 years ago, and now it's like death by 1,000 cuts. And also there was a real focus on retention there because of their small drainage areas, the small watersheds, and I'm sure everyone's heard of like in Ellicott City, the terrible floods that they had 2 years in a row, even though they were 1,000-year floods, quote unquote, where you had so much paved over area that you just had the drainage areas being giant funnels that ended in Main Street. And so they wanted to make sure that they have forests and trees on site where possible to help the water soak into the ground, to mitigate against a lot of that. So it was really about having, new site designs and like 75% on site. They also increased their replanting ratios. They also increased their fee in lieu. But they also had this good like green infrastructure guide. And another big issue they had there is like variance, where anybody who like sought a variance could basically get one. And they really cracked down on that to make sure that it was only, variances or exemptions that were, really, really worthwhile, not just, hey, I have a mansion and I want to have 2 driveways go through this pristine forest instead of 1. And that instead now would come back with a why do you need to do that kind of thing. So Baltimore City, they're more about like, they have smaller patches of forests and looking at how to really better protect those small patches. So it was really having it apply to smaller sites so that the forests right around where lots of people live, for equity reasons, et cetera, could be protected, increasing a fee in lieu, other minor improvements. But they started improving theirs, but their whole strategy in the county council, et cetera, is to like bit by bit get a lot of these kind of improvements through. And a lot of these counties are seeing that they needed to improve what they were doing anyways because of those 2019 law improvement on the fee in lieu. So while they did that, why not make it better otherwise as well? Frederick County, though, I would say now is the best in the state. They have a true no net loss of forest bill. They actually, and why it's the best in the state is they actually had two bills in one that makes it really great. One is just saying, hey, forget about, well, not forget about, but for most cases, you don't have to worry about the complicated formulas, et cetera, on the state minimum bill. It's just straight one-to-one for every acre you take down, you replant an acre, except for those few instances where you'd actually have to replant more under the state minimum. But then what they also had is that really innovative zoning bill that basically said, hey, if you have things that are identified as like priority forest, priority natural areas, if it's like a steep slope, if it's in a floodplain, that area is excluded from zoning calculations. And that was from density calculations, like how many units you can shove into a site. And that was really important because they were seeing that some developers, not all developers, but some developers, if they saw a parcel was zoned for a certain amount of units, like, hey, I'm supposed to be able to get 10 houses on this acre, they'll fight tooth and nail to get 10 houses there, even if 90% of it is a steep slope and a floodplain, et cetera. So then because of that, they would just say, oh, maybe I should just find a different area in general that doesn't have these sensitive areas, and that would be a better place to site where I'm putting this this development. So we think it's a really good model. So Montgomery County did have some modest improvements as well recently. I think Denisse may be touching on this a little bit more, but increasing their fee in lieu, and looking at some other pieces of it, but it's not the real robust no net loss policy we saw in Frederick County. So kind of what we're interested in is thinking through is Montgomery County, what kind of things can be made? Can it be as good as Frederick County? But as you could see, each of these counties have their own unique situations, unique things that made their choices and what they did a little bit different. But I will note that Frederick County is a very purple county and actually was able to pass this unanimously through a very bipartisan county council. So that's kind of what I had, and I think we're going to wait until the end to do some questions and discussions on this.
That's right. Thank you so much, Ben. And with that, I'm going to call upon Sarah to be our next presenter.
Hi there. I'm thinking Denisse might be our next presenter, just for our order.
Or if you want to pass it on to Denisse,
is that okay? And then I'll go last.
Absolutely.
That's fine with me as well.
On a bit.
All right, thanks, Hera. Thanks, Shruti. All right, I'm gonna pull up my presentation, so just bear with me 1 second. And let me know if you can see it.
We can see it, Denisse, thanks.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm Denisse Guitarra with Audobon Naturalist Society. I'm their Maryland Conservation Advocate, and I'm here to talk about Montgomery County forests. So I'll start off by showing you some graphs before we dive more into the subject matter. So to start off, I'm going to show you two graphs that are from the University of Vermont. Did a study on Montgomery County Forest back in 2011 of showing the existing tree canopy and the possible tree canopy. So as you could see on the graph on the left, more of the existing tree canopy was kind of centered towards Down County, and then the possible tree county more towards the Upper County and to the west as well.
Denisse, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're not seeing your slides change, just so you know.
Oh, okay. Let me try that again.
We're not seeing the slide show, we're just seeing the slides on the PowerPoint.
Try that again. How about now? Can you guys see the graphs of the maps?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Good thing you guys pointed that out because I was not seeing the chat. Yes, free feel to call it out if you don't see something. So let me just backtrack again. So in these two graphs, on the graph on the left shows the existing tree canopy back in 2011, and the one on the right is a possible tree canopy. So as you can see, based on this study that was conducted by the University of Vermont, which you can find in Montgomery Planning's planning department, and if Shruti or Amanda can drop the link in the chat box, that might be helpful. That existing tree canopy was more in the down county, and then the possible tree canopy was expected to be kind of the upper part of the county, more towards the west. This, of course, has changed because now we fast forward about 10 years. And now let me show you another graph, which is from the Climate Action Plan. And this one's a little bit different. So you can't really compare the two graphs that much, but it really highlights a difference. So if you see these black lines, and the areas within these like black borders are basically areas where we have high impervious surfaces and 50% or more of vulnerable communities based on the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, and areas where we basically need to focus tree canopy because of these two factors, the impervious surfaces and the vulnerable populations. So if you were kind of to compare this graph to the previous graph on the right, it really shows how, based on various factors, you can focus the amount of trees and where to plant them based on different factors. So that goes back to what Ben was showing with different counties across Maryland, that depending on which county and what factors affect those counties, you have to ensure that the forest laws or the forest policy actually plays and benefits the residents and the geography that you're most interested in protecting. So this is just a very quick overview of some of the highlights that could be considered in a Montgomery County specific forest laws policy. So a couple of organizations, including AMS and some that are here in today's call, we've been looking at trying to advocate for a no net loss to forest policy, very similar to what Frederick County just passed last year. And there are basically three or four main factors of why we would need a no net loss forest policy. And these are all centered towards creating healthy communities. And as long as we have healthy communities, we'll have healthy forests. Forests, as many of you all know in this call, can help with flood mitigation and climate change mitigation by reducing the effects of urban heat island effect and also reducing flooding. Now, two major ongoing policies that are very impacting Montgomery County are the Thrive Montgomery 2050 General Master Plan and the Climate Action Plan. Both of these plans speak to the need of protecting forests because both their climate resilience and also because of sustainable land use and kind of projecting into the future. And although they don't go as deep as saying we should do a no net loss of forest, getting a policy close to no net loss of forest will actually put in implementation a lot of the actions, the policy recommendations that both the Thrive and the Climate Action Plan speak to right now. And as my colleagues have already said, nearby counties are already pushing ahead in their different jurisdictions of no net loss of forest. So Montgomery County is about time that we also move along and we try to create a policy that will be beneficial for county residents and our forests as well. So now you may ask, well, what can you do? Right now, we don't have like a bill per se, but you can, that doesn't mean that you can't reach out to your elected officials and still start having those conversations of saying why Montgomery County needs to have a no net loss of forest policy. And although, as I mentioned, there is no specific bill right now for forest, there are two Thrive Montgomery 2050 hearings coming up in June next week and later this month, where you can still submit comments and you could make your voice heard in saying that we would like to have a no net loss forest policy as part of the Thrive Montgomery General Master Plan. And I can drop the links for where to submit your comments after today's call during the Q&A. But also it's very important to note that the Thrive hearings now, the speaker list is all full, but you can still submit written comments by the hearing dates. With that, I will pass it on to Shruti and Sarah.
Thank you so much, Denisse. Yes, we will now hear from Sarah.
Thank you so much. That's great, Denisse. Hoping everybody can see my screen.
Yes.
We can see your slide, yes.
Fantastic. All right, so fantastic things shared thus far. I'm only going to act as kind of a, like tie it up in a bow with some of the national perspective on how we manage urban forests, urban forest management in the United States. And I work at American Forests, as was mentioned earlier. And so I'm going to talk about a concept called tree equity, which is basically making sure that everybody receives the benefits, the health, wealth, and climate resilience benefits that trees provide, which you all are working tirelessly to make sure that Maryland residents can access, which is fantastic. And essentially what we know right now about our urban forests, of which Montgomery County's forests are included in those forests because the county is largely developed, is that the tree cover is uneven, right? It's kind of spread out inequitably, and that's by design, right? That's by discriminatory housing and planning practices that were instituted just after the New Deal and then have kind of maintained for generations. And so what we are dealing with right now is an equitable canopy distribution, which can be fixed. And so by having our North Star be tree equity, but be getting trees where they're needed most, caring for trees that are getting established, trying to conserve mature trees because we know that they yield the most benefits, and then making sure that we're also reusing our tree canopy cover, right? That does need to come down for diseases or pests or safety reasons. We can kind of support full cycle urban forestry management in a really productive way. And so a recent study by researcher Dave Nowak out of the Forest Service noted that we've got to plant 31.4 million trees in our urban areas alone every year to get to tree equity. And so right now, the United States plants and cares for about 12, just over 12 million trees a year. So that's more than double than what we're doing now, which we know is a huge ask. So, how can we address this need, right? And the way that we're talking about addressing that need right now on this call is via policy. And so American Forests has worked to advance lots of different policies nationally. We've kind of taken some of the really wonderful work that states are doing, like Maryland is doing, and kind of built upon that to build our national case out to advance better urban forestry management. So we have different acts like the Climate Stewardship Act, the Tree Act, which actually passed in the House in the fall. And we're building momentum right now. We're building bipartisan support for urban forest management. And so you'll get these slides after. This is a little bit of a laundry list of things, but I'll just pick out a couple highlights here to go over. One of the big policy actions that was successful, as I just mentioned, is the passing of the Tree Act, which is resulting in an additional $50 million. It's a $50 million program in Department of Energy funding to incentivize utility tree conservation and replacement, because we know that that's a huge challenge that folks are facing. We're also pushing for increasing the budget for urban and community forestry management, the Urban and Community Forestry Program, which is run out of the U.S. Forest Service. We are asking to double that budget from $40 million to $80 million, so that we're advocating for that. And a host of other acts like the Climate Stewardship Act, which would result in a brand new, basically national tree corps, similar to the Civilian Conservation Corps, to help put folks back to work and invest in this critical green infrastructure that we need to build resilient communities for the future. And so that's a little snapshot of what we're doing to build our capacity to strengthen our federal policies. We're also doing work on the program side, right? To provide tools and strategies to folks like you who are advocating every day for better management in your backyard, in your local urban forest. And so the number one way we're doing that is by delivering a tool called Tree Equity Score. So every municipality will be able to independently assess the need for their existing canopy cover and where to prioritize and how to prioritize what action. So if it's better maintenance practices, if it's actually planting more trees, if it's diversifying the species that you need to plant in order to have a resilient urban forest moving forward. All of those factors are included in a Tree Equity Score. And the tool essentially equips local stakeholders, advocates, neighborhood tree groups, and just concerned residents to hold their local officials, their departments, state, municipal, who manage urban forests accountable to actually increasing tree equity, right? So prioritizing places that need trees the most, tree canopy the most, and making sure that their investments and practices mirror where the need is. All the municipalities that are urban areas within the whole United States, I think its population cutoff is like 20,000 people, will be receiving tree equity scores in about 2 weeks. I think it's June 23rd that those scores will roll out and be nationally accessible. It's free through our Tree Equity Explorer tool. And so stay tuned for that. That's coming really shortly. So excited for everyone to be able to use that tool. What we're also doing is looking at creative ways to finance, right, ongoing maintenance for urban forests. So I know that some of the concerns and some of the topics that we're talking about tonight involve, how to actually incentivize preservation, right, and conservation. Well, we live in a capitalist society and money talks. So we are working hard to creatively fund impact bonds for cities, fund long-term maintenance through actually distributing carbon credits for urban forestry, planting and preservation projects, including nurseries and other kind of regrowth and urban reforestation initiatives. And so we're actually bringing this concept, this city forest credits kind of carbon credit concept to scale right now. So excited to offer that as a potential solution. And of course, the cause dear to my heart, which I could not let you all go without mentioning, is we need people to actually plant and care for all these trees. we can't dramatically expand, we more than double the planting and care that we do in this country without the people behind it, people who are on this line tonight. And so there are amazing pathways into urban forestry careers to become potentially certified arborists or plant healthcare technicians or biologists and the like. And what we're doing is we are working to break down barriers for underemployed, unemployed people, folks in low-income communities, folks who are facing barriers to employment at all, making sure that they can get hired, trained, and retained by our friends in the private industry, in the utility sector, and in municipalities as well. And so we are working hard to kind of grow the pipeline of qualified tree care professionals so that we can actually do what we're setting up to do, which is to achieve tree equity. And so finally, of interest, maybe of interest to folks on the line, what kind of forests are we building? Are they biodiverse? Are they going to actually be resilient in the face of climate change? We're working to address that as well. And my colleague, Dr. Ebony Hall, is leading our Roots of Rock Forest Health Restoration Project in partnership with Fender Guitarra. It's a really neat project out of actually Michigan, but essentially the idea is to plant emerald ash borer resistant ash trees and then source them as potential, as a resource basically to make musical instruments, to make guitars and make other wood products. So if we can plant resistant species, we know that our forests can stand a chance to withstand the threats and challenges that climate change has in store for them. And so lots of sprinkles of different kinds of ideas and solutions, but just kind of wanted to zoom out a little bit so that you kind of know what we're working on nationally with lots of our other forest partners. And I definitely welcome, I think it may be time, any questions that you all may have to ask us.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for your presentation. And with that, we do have another poll question that we are going to share before we jump into Q&As. All right. Where are you joining us from now? So we wanted to make sure we have participants from all across Maryland. I see one in the chat saying Central Maryland, but Western is okay. We have 69% participants from DC area, 10% from Baltimore area, 6% from Southern Maryland, 13% from Western Maryland, or as I would say, some from Central Maryland, and I don't see anyone from Eastern Shore. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And with that, we are going to jump into stop sharing results. All right, excellent. With that, we are going to jump into Q&As. And I want to make sure, excellent. All right, well, thanks to everyone for engaging in this conversation. One of the questions that we received in the chat was, are there other programs to preserve and protect existing forests? So I can, if any one of the panelists would like to answer that. I saw Kristin trying to unmute herself. Do you want to take that, Kristin?
I was waiting to see if anyone else wanted to take it first. The only thing I would mention that I'm aware of is, you can, as a property owner, if you own existing forest, you want to protect it, you can do that through an easement, through a land trust, but that's not necessarily free, and you certainly don't earn money by doing that. So that's why the bank program works so well, in my opinion. But I'm sure there are other programs, perhaps throughout Maryland, that I'm just not familiar with in Montgomery County. So I'll see if anyone else has anything to add.
All right.
Yeah, there is a myriad of programs on protecting existing forests, you know, through program open space, etc. There's also programs, there's even like some tax incentives in Maryland, although some of them are, many of them have different requirements. And that's another thing as we're thinking through the, you know, especially comprehensive state update or other updates, if those should be changed. Like, for example, for the tax incentives, I think you have to have a minimum of like 5 acres of forests, which I think for definitely myself and most people, you know, that's just out of the realm of possibility. But there's also ones, you know, for farmers, there's also lots of different incentives, especially for riparian buffers, by like the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, etc. But there's also other programs like, for example, backyard buffers and the relief program, etc., that the state does to help incentivize some of this stuff, you know, and that's all fantastic. But, you know, what we're also really trying to focus on and think about is development, especially big developers. What should be the responsibility of really big developers, and how can we try to get them as much as possible to spend money redeveloping, putting money in existing towns and cities and places where we really want to focus that investment versus going out into forests and, you know, chopping down contiguous forests. And then when they do, what do we want to make sure that those developers are ensuring happens to at least get to a place where it's no net loss, right? Even if it is, you're replacing it with something much smaller. But yeah, we'd be happy, I'm sure, to provide as far as for different programs, different incentives for homeowners, big and small, for growing trees, protecting forests, etc. And Kristin, I'm surprised you didn't jump on the bandwagon to talk about your cool little like coupon program thing.
Well, that I was, you know, answering the question in terms of forests and mature forests in particular. But if anyone, you know, is interested in planting trees, we at the planning department tend to separate forests from trees because that's how it's separated in the law. If you're interested in planting trees on your property, we have 2 awesome programs for that through Reforest Montgomery, which I just touched on very briefly at the end of my presentation. But if you go to montgomeryplanning.org/reforest, you'll see opportunities there for free and discounted trees. And we have tons of great resources on how to plant your own tree and lots of other resources too. So I hope you will take advantage of the programs that we do offer.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Ben and Kristin. The next question we have is for landowners who want to preserve for future generations. How does forest mitigation relate to conservation easements, if at all?
I don't mean to monopolize, but I can definitely take that one. In Montgomery County, at least, all forest mitigation banks and any reforestation or forest protection that's required through the Montgomery County Forest Conservation Law, all of those reforestation or forest protection areas are required to be protected in a forest conservation easement, which protects it perpetually forever. And that changes with the property ownership as well. So it's perpetual, which is amazing. So that forest will be protected forever from development.
Thank you. I see Paul Walker's hand up. Paul, I'll take your question, but we have a bunch of questions that were submitted ahead of time, so I want to make sure we get to that. So go ahead.
Thank you. Well, there are 2 things, and I'll try to be quick, but one, I came because this is about forest and forestry for the future in Maryland. So I'm surprised we haven't heard anything about HB 991 regarding, you know, a lot of it, 2/3 of the money, 10% of the trees are focused in underserved areas. And the second, which is kind of related because I'm trying to keep tabs on how far behind we're falling every year. So Ben said, we're losing 4,300 acres a year, 12 acres a day. The report I posted to you, Shruti, shows we're losing about 9,000 acres. So trying to figure what they'll plant in HB 991 in the 3 different categories looks like maybe 2,000 more acres. So we'd be running a deficit between 2,400 and 6,000 or 7,000. So we should be discussing this maybe at another time, HB 991, but we all, and Ben, yeah, please.
Okay, well, thanks. And thanks for bringing up 991. And I promise I didn't plant Paul to bring up 991 because that was something that we discussed and had to cut for time, basically. But yeah, so HB 991, that's the Tree Solutions Now, as it was ended up being called, Act, that had kind of 2 different parts of it on it. And one part that's really great about it is it funds over the next 10 years, like by 2031, the planting of 5 million trees. And yeah, and 500,000 being in underserved, communities, urban areas. And however, actually, the majority of the funding is actually going to go to those because of how much, it actually takes to plant and maintain, trees when you have to like rip up the concrete, et cetera, to do so, versus the other parts that are planting a lot of the trees are to increase incentives of other programs, like especially on for farmers planting and riparian areas, like through the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, or CREP, and giving them bonuses, and so seeing how much more giving them a bonus to do that really helped in Pennsylvania to get more trees in the ground, that we could get a lot of trees that way too. So that was a great thing that passed. And having, that money get into there, and that's going to go through, and not like the Chesapeake Bay Trust, to go through a lot of different grant programs, to go to a lot of different municipalities, go to a lot of different counties, including Montgomery County, to do a lot of great work. However, you're also absolutely right. It does not get at the issue of that continual loss of forests, right? And it's still, at the end of the day, that is $15 million a year. That's great, that's dedicated and fantastic, and it'll do so many benefits for air quality, water quality, flood control, all those other things we talked about. But it's, on the backs of taxpayers, basically. And at the same time, you're still losing, you're still going to be having net loss and all the damage that comes with it from a lot of development. So it was great that that passed. Though it is important that we really look forward to see how we can have a comprehensive fix on the state level. That also helped fund a study to really look at, we know development is the #1 cause of, of deforestation in Maryland, but really looking at exactly where it's happening, how it's happening, the real effects of all these different banking, et cetera. And it also had this piece, and I think for a comprehensive piece, we're going to have to really look at what is the answer of conservation versus reforestation, right? Like in some ways, it's good to retain a fully forested parcel and conserve that, and absolutely want to do that. And things like program open space that do that are absolutely very, very important. At the same token, if you are chopping down forests over here and then permanently protecting them over here, you're still getting further and further away from no net loss. You're still losing forests. And there's also the question of, are you permanently protecting anything that was ever in danger of being taken down in the first place, right? And in some counties, and so I don't want to say this and you thinking, oh, this is Montgomery County, that I'm overgeneralizing this or anything like that. But in some counties, I think there's also a worry of a whack-a-mole game, where we've seen that they'll preserve these places while it's convenient, but then if they want to start developing there, well, then they'll just move it over to conserve these places. And then you want to develop there, oh, we'll conserve over these places, until you get to a point where everything's either preserved or developed, and you've lost thousands of acres, right? So I do think that those are all issues and problems that we'll have to look at carefully and deal with, especially when we're thinking about it and looking at the state level. And I think that the counties can be a lot of places, a lot of things that each of these different counties are doing and upgrading that can be really good models for what could happen really well on the state. And I think Montgomery County is already doing some things that could be good models for the state, but I also think that they can really also really, get out there and do some amazing, even more, progressive and really innovative things to be an even better model for the state. And we hope that would include, really getting to a no net loss of forests.
Thank you.
I'd like to jump in a little bit, Shruti, if I can.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Christina Sorrento. I work with Kristin in Montgomery County. And we're responsible for the forest conservation and inspection and everything that has to do under the forest conservation law. And I think Ben made some really good points, but I do want to I do want to say in Montgomery County we do not play the whack-a-mole. So I just want to be clear about that, because I do know other counties sometimes do, but that is not something that we do. Once it is preserved, it's preserved. But I think it's really important, something that we noticed, and I know that getting to no net loss is really important. And that's something, that those of us that work in forest conservation, we think it is important. It is something we should be striving towards. But I can't say strong enough that by not allowing mitigation banks to allow for the preservation of existing forests has actually really set us back, because the things that we are seeing in Montgomery County now, I mean, Kristin touched upon this, but we had people in the system that wanted to preserve their land that could be developed. It wasn't land that couldn't be developed. They wanted to preserve it because they're environmentalists and they wanted to make sure that their land could be preserved for the future. And now they can't in a way that makes financial sense for their estate when they're gone. And so they don't have the opportunity to put it into a forest mitigation bank, still make some money off of the land, but preserve it. We also have folks that, because they can't make money off of it for, preserving it in a forest mitigation bank, they're looking at timber harvest. And, timber harvest has its pros and cons, but when we're looking at preserving forests, from our point of view, we don't want it to be harvested. We don't want it to be clear cut. And so I would say we are right there in support of the no net loss and working hand in hand with trying to get that to move forward. But I really think you can't talk about no net loss without talking about preserving existing forest, because it might be, like you said, Ben, it might be one step forward, one step back, but then you're talking without being able to preserve the existing forest too, with how long it takes to get the planted mitigation banks up to the point that they would even be close to what that existing forest was. I mean, it's really a step back for us. So
we got to get more creative. I'm sorry. We got to be more creative about incentivizing landowners with forest land. Hey, you've got it. And it's sort of the way Sarah's thinking about possibly justifying those performance bonds. Guess what? Pay for the climate service. It's 51 bucks a ton. So yeah, I guess so. It's taking away a tool you have now, and I understand that. Yeah, it's bad because you got to protect what you got, but we got to find other ways to do that and value it, because money makes the world go round. I'll mute myself.
Yeah, thank you so much. We do want to make sure we get to the other questions. And this is an important conversation, especially getting different perspectives and hearing from the Montgomery planning, how they view this issue and what they know, so that as activists, when we advocate and we are working on these issues, that we understand these perspectives really well. So thank you everyone for sharing that. I also want to recognize actually David Lorenzo, who is attending this event from Council Member Evan Glass's office. Thank you, David, for joining us. We invited the T&E committee members if they could attend or have a staff member attend, because As next steps, many of us activists are reaching out from environmental organizations are reaching out to talk to our Montgomery County Council members about forest conservation in Montgomery County. So with that, I do want to get to the next question and see if we can take a couple more because it's already 8:15 almost. One of the next questions, and I'm taking this from what was submitted ahead of time, so please pardon me if I'm not jumping any more into the questions in the chat. How is promoting a robust tree canopy, does the county take into account the role of the electrical power and telecommunications industries rather relentless assaults to remove older trees that compete for space with their power line corridors? Well, if anyone has, Kristin or maybe Christina, if you have any insights on this and anyone would like to share from the panel, you're welcome to. If not, we can move to the next question. How do we take into account the role of electrical power and telecommunication industry, removing older trees, competing for space with their power line corridors?
I think this question probably focuses mainly on street trees, it sounds like, which is not really an area that I'm probably best suited to answer a question about. In Montgomery County, that's really managed by the Montgomery County Department of Transportation. So unless anyone else has more to add on that, I'd suggest we just move on to the next question.
Okay, and we can also follow up with the questions we have. We can follow up and share a response with people who are asking these questions. How can we get the county's forest conservation law strengthened substantially?
I think we can all chime in a little bit into this one, but I'll take a first shot and I'll pass it on to my other panelist. I think we have already discussed many great ideas of what a forest conservation law should look like, specifically for Montgomery County. But I'm just going to highlight one extra point, which I might have missed in my presentation, which is Montgomery County is a very diverse county, and we have the largest communities of Latinx, minority groups, BIPOC individuals in general. So I think core to whatever forest conservation law and amendments that we come up with, I think at the core is not only protecting our existing forests and putting more tree plantings in the areas, especially in the urban centers where we want to reduce like urban heat island effects because of climate change and flood mitigation, but also take into account all these communities that are part of the county, and perhaps also what are their needs and how the county is basically going to grow and develop in the future as well. So there's a lot of like moving parts and pieces that come into making a strong legislation, not just from the trees, but also I would say from the people's perspective and what's good for communities as well.
I'll just add, so here, Denisse, that's everything that you said is absolutely what we need to be considering when we move forward, with any kind of amendment that introduces a no net loss idea into the forest conservation law. So I have some thoughts, and I won't say again that before we get to no net loss at the county level, we really need to fix the issue at the state level with forest mitigation banks. That's step number one, in my opinion, personally. But the other things I just wanted to bring up is you saw through my presentation just how complex the forest conservation law is. So I shared one example of a forest conservation plan with a planting requirement, with various forest conservation requirements. That is certainly not how it works for every project, right? We have some projects where we lose forests. We have some projects where it's, perhaps 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 replacement. And it's carried out through all of these different ways, depending on the unique conditions of those projects that we plug into that worksheet, right, to get that outcome. So unfortunately, it's not as simple as writing in, a very simple change to the forest conservation law. we have to look through all those different scenarios to really understand what a change, one change to the forest conservation law, how it will affect many different types of projects. So the way that I would start is through a working group with getting together all of the environmental staff in the county that implement the forest conservation law to brainstorm ideas, and from there to get the input of environmental advocates and property owners and the development community, which includes agencies, it includes the county government, to see if what we're proposing will actually work, in practice. And then beyond that, Montgomery County, just to compare to Frederick County, for example, has a much wider range of environments, right? So not only do we have 1 million people in Montgomery County versus 250,000 in Frederick, we have a much wider range of highly urban to highly rural. And that makes it a lot more complicated when it comes to creating a stronger forest conservation law that addresses all of those different environments. So I'll leave it there, but I'm very curious to see if anyone else has any thoughts on this.
Sarah?
If I could just kind of jump in here as well. Everything Denise mentioned, Kristin mentioned, I just want to echo that. One of the things that I do want to, just for some added perspective at the national level, one of the things American Forest does is we facilitate a group called the Forest Climate Working Group, which is an intersector or cross-sector group of anybody who is involved in trees and in forestry at all. So it's beyond just urban forestry. It's timber companies and wood products manufacturers, folks who are policy advocates and lobbying groups, and advocacy groups like American Forest. We have some ex officio government representatives also who serve on that group. But exactly what was mentioned before is it's going to take a village, right? It takes everybody to actually come to the table and come up with policies and an agenda that's going to actually benefit the entirety of America's forests in our case, and the entirety of Montgomery County's forests in the case that we're talking about today on the call. We also play a really active role in the Sustainable Urban Forest Coalition as well. And so we're constantly working on the rural side of things, the forest products and wood management, wood reuse side of things, carbon storage optimization, and then also on our urban forests and our nurseries and our regeneration work as well. And so, yeah, it takes everybody. And then, we kind of also serve as a go-between for other non-forestry related groups. So it's going to take all of us and more of us who maybe just have an interest in this, but who can see how forests matter, right? It may take locally in Montgomery County, it may take a coalition of school PTA groups. It may take other entities that you may not think have an exact correlation to caring about trees or the environment, but who the management of Montgomery County's forests directly affect, right? And so just thinking creatively about the groups that we want to engage in also the voices we want to have at the table is really important. And I would be remiss to not mention making sure that we have, just like, not everybody where in America is as diverse as Montgomery County is. I wish that it was, but it's not. But making sure that we have some of our underrepresented groups making sure they have voices at the table, right? So one of the things we do at American Forest is we regularly interact with tribal groups and governments and agencies to inform and support their forestry management practices as well. We work with them on a lot of nursery projects and the like, right? And in writ large, women are really underrepresented in forestry. People of color are really underrepresented in the forestry profession, right, as it is. And so we're working to get those voices at the table who maybe haven't been heard, so that we can inform the strongest policies possible.
Thank you, Sarah. Looking at the next question, what are the main insect threats to trees in Maryland?
Well, the biggest one that I'm familiar with is emerald ash borer. There are certainly others. And for a long time, the ash borer really decimated our ash trees. So a lot of the projects we focused on through Reforest Montgomery are replacing the lost forest cover that occurred through emerald ash borer, which is an invasive species that originated in Northeast Asia and really attacked ash trees throughout the region for such a long time. But some of you may have noticed that when I got to the slide on the parks reforestation projects that we take on through Reforest Montgomery, on the right side, I had a picture of some naturally regenerating ash trees. So we're very hopeful, and that's within one of our existing reforestation projects. So I'm hopeful that at this point, perhaps the emerald ash borer has moved on from these areas, and hopeful that those trees will survive. But there are certainly others as well. So I'll see if anyone else has anything.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we can go on in that list for quite a while. I think that Kristin was right at putting emerald ash borer at the top. But you also have the Asian longhorn beetle, right? You have, I mean, you go back even looking at the gypsy moths. There's the hemlock woolly adelgid. Japanese beetles, the list unfortunately goes on.
Thank you. All right, the next question I have is, how are Maryland state forests managed and harvested?
I mean, that's a pretty wide question, but I think that why I wanted to speak up is one thing I do want to put a pin in is that I think there's a big difference between doing selective harvest and managing a forest, and you can do that to have a number of different best management practices on forests that you could do that might help prevent from forest fire or, might help get one different types of species or another, right? And I think there's a big difference between sustainably harvesting forests and completely converting a forest to a parking lot, right? And while I understand those that really want to just protect all forests at all costs, etc., I just feel like the biggest problem right now in Maryland is the conversion wholesale of forests to those, paving over paradise and putting up a parking lot type of thing. I think that maintenance is also a very important thing, especially when you're talking about the invasive species, or you're talking about deer and how much deer will browse, regenerate and prevent regeneration of forests, etc. And so that's really important. And I do think that one of the good upgrades that was done in that, when I was talking about modest upgrades of Montgomery County, where they increased the maintenance period, for example, a little bit, and looked at some of the maintenance around forests and how to improve that a little bit too, which I think is an important step forward. But as far as forest maintenance in general, I'll leave that to Sarah or others that have a lot of knowledge on the panel.
I'd like to comment. I attended a nationwide Sierra Club forest management meeting, and it turns out in many states, one of the best tools is to have farmers convert from a soybean crop or corn crop to a wood product crop. It actually works. So it's another tool that we can add to our toolbox if a farmer wants to do that.
Thank you, Mark. Ken, I see your hand is up, and then I have something from the chat.
Yes, thank you. So my question is, how do we square doing stream restorations to meet our MS4 permits that destroy forests in their footprint with our efforts to protect the forest? I'm a member of the Montgomery County Water Quality Advisory Group, and we were told that for our last MS4 permit, Montgomery County restored, quote unquote, restored 30,000 linear feet of stream. So I said, well, how many acres of forest did you destroy to do those projects? And they have to bring in heavy equipment to do that. They couldn't answer me. They don't keep track of that. And the reason is, I think the primary reason is because they get credit, MS4 credit, by the linear foot of stream, and they don't pay any attention to how much forest they destroy as a collateral issue. Anybody have any comments on that?
Well, thanks for sharing that, Ken. And I don't know if our panelists today have any comments on that. It's 8:28. If they don't, we can certainly follow up. I do want to mention that when we discuss this panel, we use that as a starting point to have this conversation and hope to have another conversation, because I know what you're bringing up is also important. Christina, I saw that you unmuted yourself. Did you want to make a remark?
Yeah, just really quick. I mean, some of those projects do have to come through the forest conservation process, and so they do have to replant the areas that they're disturbing. I mean, obviously they're still disturbing those areas, but they do have to mitigate for it and replant. And the others that don't come through the whole process, and if they use the exemption, they still have replanting that they need to do. And it's sometimes that's even more replanting that they had to do through the forest conservation plan process. So they should actually know those numbers. I was kind of surprised that they told you they didn't.
Well, yeah, I mean, I appreciate what you said about the replanting, but I think we all realize that when you go in with bulldozers and you destroy an intact forest ecosystem, even those that are not pristine, and at least our DP, they're quick to point out they're not pristine, everyone knows that, but by going in and planting hundreds or even thousands of saplings, does not, it's not like planting a meadow in a can. You can't plant a forest in a can. It'll take who knows how many dozens or hundreds of years to reconstitute the forest, but good point.
Well, thank you. I just want to quickly go around and ask if any of the panelists have any closing comments to make. We will be sending out a thank you email with a link for you to submit any comments or further questions that you may have to help us continue having this conversation and tie it into some of the other issues that intersect with this. So I really appreciate the questions and comments that were shared in the chat as well as ahead of time. So just real quick check with our panelists. Does anybody have any closing comments based on the questions you heard? All right, seeing none. Again, just thanks to all of you for joining us today for this very important topic, and please stay tuned. Send us your feedback, send us what else you would like to hear on this issue, and we look forward to engaging you on this conversation as we continue to talk to county officials on this issue. Again, remember to listen to the Thrive 2050 testimonies that are coming up, and we shared some links in the chat that we would be happy to send in a follow-up email to everyone. Have a good evening, and thank you again.